chair significant?
Is the empty chair. There we go.
There we
Chair
are.
Elijah.
I was looking at our class on the Facebook page, which has got a little delay. So I hope everyone had a good weekend, a good holiday weekend. I know some people were cleaning up and doing home stuff around their homes. Probably some people traveled too. I was actually at the Hollywood Bowl Sunday night. And when I went out to the Hollywood Bowl Sunday night, you're going to want to ask, what did I see? I saw Air Supply and Michael Bolton, which was, I had no idea it was the ultimate karaoke event. It was fun. Yeah, it was fun. But I'm out, we were picking up food to bring into the place, and I see this sign. We picked up food at Sun Cafe over by on Ventura and right where it turns south. So I saw this sign on this apartment building. So yeah, so it was on an apartment building. We were in the Sun Cafe is a tiny little place. Probably haven't seen it before, but it's like I don't know. It's like Cahuenga, right where Ventura Boulevard turns and starts going down Studio City. So I saw this sign from Jeremiah, and what's interesting is it's such a positive message, right? Such a great positive message that Jeremiah gives people here. It's kind of a little taken out of context, but still, you know, it's not what you think about. When we think about Jeremiah, we think about the negativity and the warnings and the scary stuff. But it shows you that, you know, again, like if that was the only line you knew that was from Jeremiah, you maybe think, wow, that guy's got a really positive attitude. But again, it shows you that no prophet is one thing or another. But you can see how if things are taken out of context and you don't really have the full view of what the author's talking about, you might you might think it's about something else. But it is interesting that Jeremiah in the end is got a hopeful message in the sense that he believes the Jewish people will continue on. As we read, he goes so far as even buying property in the land of Israel as a statement of the faith that he has that one day the Jewish people will come back. I hope Reverend Lynn comes today because she's always interested in Midrash, and I want to show you at least some of the Midrash we have about Jeremiah. What? I'll send it to you.
Okay.
I'll put it here. I'll actually put it here up in the chat for everybody, which you can.
Can I say something? Hi, Judith. Hi, Rosemary.
You missed what I said though during this. You were coming in. I went to see Michael Bolton and Air Supply on Sunday. It was a very I don't know. But I want to tell you something. He did not look good, Michael Bolton. No, he looks. No, he's 70, but kind of in a weird way. But no, he does not look good. He froze a lot.
Really?
No, it wasn't good. The guys from Air Supply are 74 and 73. They're older than him.
Yeah.
And they were jumping around the stage and they look good. But I'm telling you right now, that might be the last time that the guy is able to perform live. It was not a good situation.
Well, at least he's still alive.
He is.
They can't hear it.
Yeah, they can. They can hear you. They can hear you.
Hi, Judith.
Hi.
Who is it? I can't hear.
Doreen,
Oh, hi, Dory.
Rosemary,
So
Doreen.
they can hear you. It's not as easy to hear you, but they can hear you. They know you're alive, Doreen. Well, they know that somebody's alive in here, but
It's only your word for it that it's Doreen.
that's true. She says you'll have to take my word for it that it's Doreen. It could be a simulation. It could be the new Doreen simulation that they've been
Right.
talking about.
It could be an AI Doreen.
The
That
AI
makes it
Doreen.
scary.
Who owns the rights to Doreen's face?
Doreen's face. Who owns Doreen's face? The
Yeah.
AI?
Yeah.
You never know. I did an AI photo of myself last week. No, I know you're looking at me like, why would you do that? I had some headshots done a couple years ago. I was not happy with. There's a company that does AI photos. You send in selfies of yourself and it generates an AI photo of you. So like you say, I want a professional photo with me in a suit. Creates it. It's crazy. It actually, the photo looked like, and I'll show you one. It actually looked like a real photo. I mean, some of them were kind of funny. I'm not going to show you the funny ones, but there were some photos there that I'm like, that I'm using that photo. And it was all done with selfies. Problem was I sent in some of the photos I sent in were photos that the ones I didn't like. And so it only can work on the stuff that you give it. But it was really weird because
So much with your face.
correct. They cannot, here, I'll show you. I did not take these photos. So I thought they came out like I could be like a candidate, on these. Here, I'll show you. This photo was not, this was a AI generated photo. I did not do that photo. These are not, that photo is AI. I did not sit for that picture or that picture.
Well, they did a great job.
So I just want to tell you, that is crazy because like, on one of them there is. Actually, no. And I sent in photos with a yarmulke, but they did do one with a hat. They did one with a golf cap. I don't golf. Yeah, I'll show you. That was one of the ones I really didn't like. No, I'm not going to show it. But anyways, it's crazy that and I authorized it. I told them to do it, but they had generated photos that never existed. And you look at it and go, oh, totally looks like a normal photo.
I'll give you that it looks like a normal photo, but it's not a good photo of you.
Some of them I'm going to use because they're the best ones I
Some
have.
of them looked good to me.
So they
I
look.
thought it made him look really old.
Thank you,
Well,
thank you,
you
Judith.
told-
Thank you, Judith. Thank
No,
you,
but
Judith.
you don't look that
No,
old in
they're-
person. Blazer.
Actually, no, Judith. What I didn't like, because I sent them the pictures. Like this is what I didn't like before, is I had these like enormous bags under my eyes. Like I sometimes have bags under my eye, but in these photos that I did, I was like, holy moly! So I didn't. I didn't love that, but I gave them those, and
Could you have said with no bags under the other? Like tell them no bags under the.
well, I did. I sent it back, and I said, edit these bags out, and they didn't. They didn't do it. Yeah.
That's not very cool.
Yeah, well, whatever. So, yeah, it is what it is, but I got what I, kind of got what I sent, but it is an amazing technology and it is definitely coming into our lives, AI. And again,
Scary.
but for those kind of things, it's scary and it's kind of, you want to have some level of acknowledgement that, this was not real, but I think what
Have
people
deep fake written on it in big letters.
yeah, but I think what people are really worried about is that, that at the end of the day that, if computers have control of our lives, they're going to make decisions that, we're essentially going to turn over life and death issues to computers. And yeah, that's what people scare. People are scared by that because even if the decision is made, because computers are going to make decisions dispassionately, right? They're going to make decisions without concern
They can
for
only
feelings.
make just decisions as dispassionately as the data they have, and the data they have is very skewed.
Correct, but it's still done without empathy, without experience, without the kinds of things that we take into consideration. Yeah. So yeah, people have talked about it. Yeah, people have talked about it in the past. People have been speculating about it. The great Star Trek episode where the original Star Trek episode where computers basically decide
Yeah.
the fate of war and people get into a machine to be killed because the computer tells them that they have to because they've eliminated the messiness of war. And of course the Enterprise disregards the prime directive and screws up their computer systems so that they're going to have to either come up with a peace plan or they're going to have to stop, but they're going to have to stop killing their, but that kind of speculative fiction we've had for a long time. And now we're starting to get to a point where we can start to do it. But yeah, it is a crazy thing that we live in this world now where we can really start to see how it plays out in maybe less impactful ways now, but could possibly do stuff in the future.
What scares me more than any of it is the ability to completely blur the lines between fact, fiction, truth, all of that. Because, I right now could be somewhere else, but, oh, I'm recorded on Facebook, so I have an alibi. And
Yeah.
that's what scares me, because they're so good that you can make stuff up.
Right. So there's two things that I think that relate to what we're going to be doing today and what we do every week when we study Torah. The first is that only in the last couple of centuries has this idea of fact, verifiable fact, even been an issue, right? So when people talk about the Torah being a verifiable fact or what in here is factual, that question is a modern question. That's not an ancient question. That's not even a question from 200 or 300 years ago. Before we had photographs, Judith, you have to think about it. Until we had photographs or video, no one ever thought something could be verified or we could have evidence that something happened, right? Until that happened, until that moment where we transferred into a mindset where, well, show me the proof. We never asked that question. So what we think of as a fact, is really not, for most of human history, even something that could have been verified. If people felt that the thing was true, then people accepted it to some extent as truth.
And that's why you have to have two witnesses, and your witnesses have to have two witnesses, and
correct. But the idea of something that happened historically happening, there was no way. No one even asked the question.
People acted on it as if it were true.
Well, at the end of the day, they had to believe whether what was being said was truthful or had an element of truth to it, in the sense that it had something to it that wasn't necessarily, again, a fact, but was something that even if it had happened or couldn't for sure say it happened, that people said, well, yeah, but that seems true. That seems like it's something that we can believe there is a truth to it. Again, not necessarily fact. So that's one thing that I think is real important as we think about the Bible, is the fact that for most of human history, nobody said, well, did this really happen? They didn't ask that question. The other thing that I think is really important to think about is when we think about computers and we think about data and those kind of things, and putting computers into a situation where they have power over us, one of the things that the Bible tells us and kind of guides us is that what we have to be careful about is that God doesn't make decisions based on data. God doesn't. The Bible tells us over and over again that God makes decisions and then either changes his mind, God's mind is changed, or God regrets or feels that something needs to be changed or done. So therefore, God doesn't make calculations based on just data. There's an element to God's decisions that is based on experience. It's based on empathy. It's based on feelings or emotions that we don't usually ascribe to computers. So people say, well, they're going to make computers that have some type of ability to actually weigh in these kinds of factors, but we've not been able to do that. There's a level of experience and human understanding that we haven't been able to put into computers. And I think that's where people start to get, when they really think about it, they realize that's the scary thing, to have something making a decision where there isn't a way to appeal to a sense of compassion, because even God can be appealed to. Jeremiah does it. All the prophets do it. I mean, you'll see it.
You have a computerized strike zone. It's, there's no human effect.
Yeah. What people are afraid of is, again, turning life and death issues over to something that is not going to be able to have compassion and have human emotions. So this is an interesting, like, when we make these decisions for the future, we actually can look back to the Bible itself for guidance on this, because even though the Bible is messy, it's that messiness that actually prevents us from the cold, hard, look of what how the computer looks at things. So that being said, as we come to the end of Jeremiah, we're going to see a little bit of that. And again, we will look at some of the midrash, some of the legends about what happens to Jeremiah in particular, because as we've discussed, we really don't have it in the text. Well, you'll see it. I've kind of told you that things are not chronological. We've actually kind of read about what happens to Jeremiah already. But let's take a look at how the book ends. So we went about halfway through chapter 51, and then we're going to read this last part of 51 and 52. And so what 50 and 51 were prophecies against the Babylonians themselves. We had just to again remind people, Babylon is the Babylonians, the Chaldeans are basically the foretold end to them is that they're going to be destroyed by a powerful nation, and actually an alliance of powerful nations that, as we saw, comes out of the north, and also we would say the east. But the area of, just to show you again, it talked about Ararat, it talked about Mini, and it talked about Ashkenaz, and again, the kings of Media. And these are the Persian Empire and their allies that are going to be the ones who bring them to an end. And the last thing we read about was this destruction of the war with the war club, the Clay Milchama, which is war club and weapon of battle. And over again, I clubbed man and woman, young and old. And again, this is Babylonia will be punished for what they did to Israel, what they did to Judea, what they did to us, what they did to Zion. So there is going to be a punishment, and that's where we're picking up. So I think either we were finished with this or we'll start with it today. This is, if you'd like to take over, Rosemary, this is where we're starting.
See, I will deal with you, O mountain of the destroyer, declares God, destroyer of the whole earth. I will stretch out my hand against you and roll you down from the crags and make you a burnt out mountain. They shall never take from you a cornerstone or foundation stone. You shall be a desolation for all time, declares God. Raise a standard on earth, sound a horn among the nations, appoint nations against her, assemble kingdoms against her, Ararat, Nini, and Ashkenaz, designate a marshal against her, bring up horses like swarming locusts, appoint nations for war against her, the kings of Media, her governors, and all her prefects, and all the lands they rule. Then the earth quakes and writhes, for God's purpose is fulfilled against Babylon, to make the land of Babylon a waste without inhabitant. The warriors of Babylon stop fighting. They sit in the strongholds, their might is dried up. They become women. Her dwellings are set afire, her bars are broken. Runner dashes to meet runner, messenger to meet messenger, to report to the king of Babylon that his city is captured from end to end. The fords are captured, and the swamp thickets are consumed in fire, and the warriors are in panic. For thus said God of hosts, the God of Israel, fair Babylon is like a threshing floor ready to be trodden. In a little while, her harvest time will come. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, devoured me and discomfited me. He swallowed me like a dragon. He filled his belly with my dainties and set me down like an empty dish. Then he rinsed me out. Let the violence done me and my kindred be upon Babylon, says the inhabitant of Zion, and let my blood be upon the inhabitants of Chaldea, says Jerusalem. Assuredly, thus said God, I am going to uphold your cause and take vengeance for you. I will dry up her sea and make her fountain run dry. Babylon shall become rubble, a den for jackals, an object of horror and hissing without inhabitant. Like lions, they roar together. They growl like lion cubs. When they are heated, I will set out their drink and get them drunk that they may become hilarious, and then sleep an endless sleep, never to awake, declares God.
And that's where we finished, actually. That's the last line that we read last week. And this is, you can see the animals. We talked about the lions that were used in the imagery here, and it continues here with,
I will bring them down like lambs for slaughter, like rams and he-goats. How has Sheshach been captured? The prize of the whole earth been taken. How has Babylon become a horror to the nations?
yeah, and we mentioned this before. What is Sheshach? That is the code. The code. Sheshach is the Atbash code. Right here, Sheshach is Babylon. And so right here, that's used together. So sometimes Sheshach is used by itself as a code, and sometimes it is used as it is here, very blatantly and very obviously, that Sheshach is Babylon. So again, I'll show you the, let me I'll show you the Atbash code right here. So we know right here from this place that the Atbash is here, I'll show you, is Bavel, because right here it says it right next to it. So let me just show you. So the Wikipedia will show you. Sheshach is mentioned in 2526. You know, if you didn't know what it was, it is the Atbash. Does not appear in a map for any other documents. So we knew that it was a little strange, right? So here's Atbash code. It's a very simple cipher. It's not hard. So Aleph becomes a Taf, Bet becomes a Shin, etc. So Aleph, Taf, Taf, Aleph. And so it reverses the alphabet. You basically just take the alphabet and run it backwards. So again, it would be in a code if you had A becomes Z, Z becomes A, etc. B is Y. So it works if you have an alphabet that has an even number of letters. But again, it would be like if I set up a code, it doesn't work very well in English because in Hebrew you can vocalize things with dots. You don't, our vowels are. It's hard when you put a vowel in place of a consonant, it doesn't work as well. So like if an A becomes a Z, it's not gonna work. But because the vowels in Hebrew are not letters, it works. So I mean, you could I mean a 3-letter English one would be, for example, if well, I don't want to give people actually that's a horrible one. It wouldn't work very well anyways. But if I was going to say the CIA, I would say the XRZ, which that's just a simple code for how someone would use a cipher to if they wanted to hide something, and it's very easy to do at Bosch code. So
We did that a lot in programming.
yeah. And as you can see, due to the fact that there's only one way to perform this, the Atbash cipher provides no communication security as it lacks any sort of key. If multiple collating orders are available, which one was used, encryption can be used as a key, but this does not provide any more significant security, considering that only a few letters can give away which one was used. So it's makes no sense. And again, Atbash comes from Aleph Taf Bet Shin. So that's how we get the word Atbash. Aleph Taf Bet Shin.
How did they know that it was encryption?
Because and again, this is a sign that people have used ciphers for a long time. When it's used earlier on in the Bible, we don't. People are like, what's Sheshach? But here it uses them right next to each other. So there's no question. What is it? Right. So here's the shin chet, and so it's bet lamed. So it was easy. Once people see it in the same thing, it's like, so people knew it for a long time because it was in Jeremiah too. But yeah, and when it's used earlier, there's no explanation. So you just have to know. I mean, you have to read the whole book to essentially get to that code. But it tells you that they used code and that they obviously they would use it in they used it in the Bible, which again, there's a little bit of everything in the Bible, which again, people have looked at, there's other codes, especially one in the Christian Bible. The most famous one, of course, is the one that which you might know because it's been talked about before, which is the number 666, which we now believe that using gematria, that this was the gematria. This is the numerical equivalent for Nero Caesar. So when the Bible uses the word 666, from the Christian Bible, in the book of Revelations, they're actually talking about Nero, the Roman, not about the devil, but they're talking about him in particular. So again, again, this is not a Jewish thing, but it's not in a Jewish book, but it's using a Jewish style of numerology, which is the gematria, where the letters have numerical equivalents. But so these codes have been used. Why would they use it? So that people wouldn't know that they're talking about the Romans. So the reason for using the codes is so you don't get persecuted further. And so the Bible has codes. I mean, we know it has codes. This code is obvious, but there's other codes that It wasn't until the 1800s, as you saw, that people started talking about what the numerical code was for that number of the beast, so to speak, which again has become a quaid. Everyone who's seen Omen knows that it's, the number of the beast, but the reality is it has nothing to do with the devil. It has to do with the Roman emperors and history. So there are other codes in the Bible. Some of them we just are completely, we know that they're there. We just don't know what they mean because we don't know what they're talking about. We don't know the reference point from what they're talking about. So anyways, that was the code, and also that's the cipher, and also the code.
Can you I remember quite a few years ago reading about, I think it was in the middle of the 1800s, that a guy came and he dug up the gates of Babylon. He knew exactly where they would be, and he surprised all the indigenous people by building up, digging, exactly where to dig these gigantic big gates. Do you remember that?
Well, there's a few places I think you're talking about. One of them were the Ishtar gates that were dug up by the Germans. The German archaeologists did in the 1800s, dig up those gates. The European archaeologists who went in and dug up some of these places, again, used scientific method and were able to, I don't think there was nothing magical about it. They were able to kind of look at locations from the standpoint of, in some cases, just scientifically understanding that outcropping shouldn't be there unless it was man-made. And so
right,
they would go dig up things that, again, it was obvious that this was a man-made mound, even though you couldn't tell from looking at it from the outside that it was man-made, because it looked just like a mountain. And they would go, oh, that's a tell. That's a, as we know from Israel, they go, oh, that's a tell. That is an archaeological site. It's not a mountain. It's a man-made situation. So those exist. Yeah, those exist all over the world. And now we're using, we're using infrared technology. We're using sonar technology. We're using lots of aerial photos and drone photos now to be able to map out archaeological excavations that were completely impossible before these technologies, especially, like in Latin America and Central America. We're able to go in and Asia, in these dense forests where they couldn't even see, that there was a temple. They can go in and do these things now. So it's pretty cool. It's in the Middle East, it was strange because there's people that were living nearby, as you said, Gail. There were people that in some cases were living right on top of these things, and they didn't know that there was
and
level.
I read it was all sand. It was sand, and then they just knew where to dig, and these amazing, and the indigenous people were just shocked that this had been there all along.
Yeah, that's kind of, in a funny way, they depict that in Raiders of the Lost Ark. They go into these places and they'll start digging under the sands of Egypt, and they'll show people that they uncover their own history. As some people have remarked to me, especially the people, we had some friends that went to the British Museum this last year. A lot of these treasures are in Britain, or they're in France, or they're in Germany, and the countries want to have their stuff back. We even had some examples of that here at the Getty in California. We had to give back to Greece some really prized treasures that the Greeks asked for. And we gave them back. The Getty gave back millions of dollars of treasures back to Greece. And if you go to the Getty, it'll say, or I don't know if it still does, but the Getty Villa, they would say this piece was here, it was returned back to Greece, or they'll say this is on loan, it's going back to Greece, or they've given us permission to display this. But of course, that's not the case with some of Greece's greatest treasures, which they'd like to have back from the British Museum. But They will not give it back. Well, I don't want to say never, but it's definitely a bone of contention between the British and the Greeks over the Elgin marbles. So it's a ongoing bone of contention between two NATO allies. Yeah, well, we'll see. I mean, we'll see what happens in the future. So when it comes to Babylonia, a lot of those treasures are in England, France, and Germany. And if they weren't, they would have been destroyed by ISIS. So it's a little difficult to argue the merits of returning them when that could have happened 5 or 6 years ago, 7 years ago. All right, so let's continue with what's going to be in store for Babylonia. And again, the Persians did these things. Babylonia didn't become completely without human life, because it's Baghdad today, and there's people that still live there, and unfortunately, people still dying there too by the thousands in our lifetime. But let's read this. Let's continue to read this and maybe talk about that.
The sea has risen over Babylon. She is covered by its roaring waves. Her towns are a desolation, a land of desert and steppe, a land nobody at all lives in, and no human passes through. And I will deal with Bel in Babylon and make him disgorge what he has swallowed. And nations shall no more gaze on him with joy. Even the wall of Babylon shall fall. Depart from there, O my people. Save your lives, each of you, from God's furious anger.
So Doreen just asked about Bel, and Bel is mentioned last week, is the god, one of the gods of Babylonia, one of the gods that they would sacrifice to. We read about him later on in the book of Daniel, and actually an apocryphal book called Bel and well, in the apocryphal book, Daniel goes to war against not goes to war, but he defeats the priests of Bel. And again, Bel was probably worshipped with these amazing ovens, and at least the descriptions in the book of Daniel. I'll just show you right here. This is a part of, I always love this book because it sounds so mystical. Bel and the Dragon. It's in the extended book of Daniel, right? And it's in the Septuagint. It's in an old book of old version of the Bible, right? The Septuagint's very old, but as you can see, it is unknown to early rabbinic Judaism. And while it's considered non-canonical by most Protestants, it's canonical to Eastern Orthodox Christians, and it's found in the Apocrypha section of 80 Protestant Bibles. So again, it's a part of the book of Daniel, part of the Daniel stories, if you will. And as you can see, there are a couple of additions to it. Song of Three Children, Three Holy Children, Susanna and the Elders, and Bel and the Dragon. And Susanna and the Elders is an interesting book because it's very similar to the book of Judith, right? Which is also an apocryphal book. So Susanna and the Elders is a similar book, and has some, interesting similarities with a woman hero story. But anyways, and Judith's story itself is very similar to the story of Deborah and Barak and Yael. Anyways, but here you can see in the story of Bel, it says the king asked Daniel, they're talking about King Nebuchadnezzar, do you think Bel is a living god? Do you see how much he eats and drinks every day? To which Daniel answers, the idol is made of clay and covered in bronze and cannot eat and drink. So you can see What does he do? So they have a shoot off, whatever, a contest against each other. The priest challenged the king. And then what does he do? Here's what Daniel does. He shows that he throws ashes over the floor to show that the priests are taking the food and not giving it to Bel. So and so the priests of Bel are arrested, confessing their deed, reveal the secret. They snuck in and were taking the food. They, their wives and children are put to death, and Daniel is permitted to destroy the idol of Bel in the temple. So that's that part of the story. There's another companion story which says that there was a great dragon which the Babylonians revered. Sometime after the temple's condemnation, the Babylonians worshiped the dragon, snake or a lizard. The king says that unlike Bel, the dragon is a clear example of a live animal. Daniel promises to slay the dragon without aid of sword. And so what does he do? He takes pitch, fat, and hair and makes a cake out of it, and the dragon eats it, and he's burst open after he eats it. So that is the story of Daniel and Bel, the story of the Bel priests and the dragon. Why do those stories even exist in Daniel? Well, you just read that. And again, this is Daniel's one of the latest books to come about. It says right here, he swallowed me like a dragon, right? So the word tanin is used here in the book of Jeremiah. So there are dragons that are mentioned in the context of Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian worship and Babylonian priests and what's going to happen to the Babylonians. So, and again, it has to do with what happens here. Bel is going to be dealt with. The god of Babylonia will be dealt with and make him disgorge what he has swallowed. So this idea of, again, and we'll read it when we get to the book of Daniel, and maybe again we'll talk about a little bit about these other books, these apocryphal additions to Daniel that we don't have as Jews. Again, I was always fascinated by them because they were written by Jewish people. They just weren't included in the Bible, in our version of the Bible. And I mean, they don't change our vision of Daniel. They don't really add much to it, but they're kind of cool. They're good stories. And I always like reading them. I never felt like the rabbis didn't want people to read these stories that they didn't include. But on the other hand, they have their own midrash as well, which sometimes was based on these things. But, if it wasn't in the Bible, it wasn't part of our story to some extent. So the rabbis do warn us about reading those stories, but I don't know. Maybe I'd never heard those warnings, or I wasn't raised by people who thought that, reading something would necessarily mess you up. But the rabbis did. The rabbis didn't want people to generally read stuff that was not official stuff. But that's, every culture has that. I mean, I'm not going to jump on the rabbis for saying that when Christian leaders basically didn't let their people read at all. So I'm not gonna hold the rabbis responsible any, more for, at least they let people read and study rather than, not even letting people read and have access to the Bible at all. That's why the Bible was only in Latin, because people didn't know Latin and they had no knowledge of what anyone was telling them other than what the priest told them.
So, I have a question. 2025, 2023. Right? Science has come leaps and bounds. It's only going to get even crazy. Right? How do you, and I asked you that question. How do you, now looking at this, which is 2,300 years old, 2,500 years old, and we know that presence of some type of animal or something is, goes far beyond that. right? How do you marry the two? But let me go on one more question, which is, and I really don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but I can't help it, right? Because we were both Game of Thrones fans, you know, and now Jeremiah is actually mentioning dragons. And maybe I just haven't been a good student. Maybe it's been mentioned in the last 2 years that I've been going, but right. So now I'm starting to think, okay, dragons are dragon. I mean, come on, you know, it's a flying thing with fire coming out. So that's multiple questions.
So first of all, when the Bible talks about dragons, we're not exactly sure if they're talking about really big reptiles, which is one possibility. You know, are they talking? I mean, some people have speculated that they're just talking about really big reptiles. So technically speaking, sometimes when it talks about these dragons, or it seems as they're talking about dragons, that they're actually talking about like a really big crocodile. That's one possibility, especially when they talk about them in Egypt. When they talk about them in Babylonia, it's a little bit tougher. Now, they do have river crocodiles in the Euphrates and in other parts of other rivers. They have river reptiles that are scary, but is this what they're talking about? Maybe. But there does seem to be at least this idea that there are reptiles that are larger, that are scarier, and there are people talking about the fact that they had knowledge of dinosaurs. And are they always, when they're talking about these things, are they talking about dinosaurs? The problem also too is sometimes they're talking about clearly things that live in the water. These are not necessarily the things that live in the water, but sometimes they're talking about whales or giant squid or things that are water beasts that seem to be also things that they talk about. And then there's the possibility that, again, though we've never found any evidence for it, that there actually are dragons that they're talking about. I think part of the reason why it's an interesting speculation is because they're talked about in every culture. So Asia has versions of them. Europeans have versions of them. You know, the Bible might be having versions of them. So were they talking about something that, you know, everybody has a version of it? So was there something like that? I mean, I don't have an answer for it because we don't have proof of it. There's no evidence for it.
Fine, moving on.
But your bigger question is,
I
Okay.
developed it a little bit more.
all right,
If you went to private religious school,
yeah,
I don't care what religion, right?
Yep.
Private religious school for from 0 to 12.
which I did.
So you were probably never taught about dinosaurs, correct?
Yeah, no, I was because
well-
if you go to a very religious school where they,
Well, okay.
yes,
Okay.
where they're not going to tell you that they're older than 6,000 years.
Well, if you go to a religious school that doesn't teach.
Yeah.
So nowadays, how do modern day clergy, right? That you know, I don't care.
Yeah.
What religion, how are they marrying up science, right?
With the Bible, right? Okay, so
Which has a little bit
there's
to do with it.
so there's
I want to talk about it after.
no, but there's two. No, this is always something that's on our minds, right? And it goes back to what I said earlier about this issue of what's truth and what's fact. So one of the things that I think one approach that people take when they're trying to figure this out is they literally say, look, the Bible doesn't deal with the scientific inner workings of how things operate. And so the Bible is not really that concerned with it. People who, you know, some people will have the answer that if God can do anything, God can give us challenges to what appears to be logical, but in God can do it. So God can make these things. So once you go down that road, then anything is possible. And so the answer is, well, those bones that you find that are carbon dated, that are older than 6,000 years, that are, 500,000 years old, those are, God puts us those. I mean, this is the answer. I don't believe this answer, but this is the answer that's given, that God puts those there as a challenge to us to make us, to make those people who are going to doubt God do it. So they can basically say, those are for people, those are stumbling stones so that people who are going to not have faith, they're gonna be destroyed by that. So that's one answer that's given, and then anything can be dismissed. Any science can be dismissed with that. So most Jews don't follow that. So how do Orthodox Jews deal with the historicity of the Bible with also science? The answer from the Jewish perspective is that time in the Bible isn't calculated the way you think it is, or the way it seems is on the surface, right? So they'll say that 1,000 years in the Bible is not 1,000 years. 1,000 years is 1,000,000 years. And so when it talks about 6 days of creation, it's not literally 6 days the way you and I would say 6 days are, but a day to God is 1,000,000 years. So they will say that the traditional Jewish answer is to try to synthesize scientific fact with the Bible and say, well, just because you say it seems pretty plainly that it says a day, for God, a day could be 1,000,000 years. And so the answer is, it's there, you just are reading it wrong. And that's the way that Judaism, especially traditional Judaism, deals with the science of fossils, geology, astrophysics, everything that you would say, but it's not 6,000 years old. They'll say, yeah, it's not 6,000 years old because it's not 6,000 years the way you and I calculate 6,000 years. So that's the answer that's given there, which is an answer which essentially says we don't have to divorce ourselves from scientific fact. I don't know what's going to happen in the future when will we create a society where people are coexisting with a complete denial of science. I mean, we are essentially now anyways, but whether or not, we're able to continue to do that, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if we're going to reach a breaking point where people, will have to make a decision, but I don't know. I mean, I heard an interesting, weird discussion that's still preying on my mind between Russell Brand and Tucker Carlson that's out there. I don't know where it was on Russell Brand's show, but the two of them are talking about this issue. And, there's people on the right and the left that are basically saying, we're going to have to create a situation where people can exist in the same country, but essentially live completely different realities, and we'll just have to accept it. I mean, we'll have to be able to accept that we're going to have, and we do. I mean, we essentially accept it now. We have schools that teach creationism, and we allow people to do that. There's a question of whether they can get state funding or not, but generally speaking, we've tried to separate church and state when it comes to education, but who knows? I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but we're kind of doing it now, but at some point we might have to formalize what that means and basically tell people, hey, look, the issue becomes an issue when it affects abortion laws or whatever, where this on a state level, people say, yeah, but what are we going to allow in this state? Essentially, until it becomes an issue where people are confronted with your rules affecting my rules, no one really says anything about it. I guess we'll be having that discussion for a long time. All right. So it says here in Jeremiah where we left off that even the wall of Babylon shall fall, which means again, even the greatest Babylonian infrastructure pieces will collapse. So we know about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon from the descriptions of the ancient world. We know about the Wall of Babylon from several sources. Again, these are Babylonians' great accomplishments. They're all going to be worth nothing. And the Babylonian dynasty that we're talking about here, the new Babylonian dynasty that was Nebuchadnezzar's empire, and it continues on with his kids. It doesn't last very long. It doesn't last very long. It lasts about 70 years, and then it comes to an end. The Persians destroy it, and the Persian Empire that succeeds it. So the Assyrian Empire lasted about 100 years, not quite at its peak it's less than 100 years, but the Assyrian Empire lasts about that time. The Babylonian Empire doesn't even last 100 years. And then the Persian Empire, which succeeds both of these empires, that empire lasts until the time of Alexander the Great. So that empire lasts about 200 years. And that is an empire that is even bigger than the preceding ones and lasts beyond one family. So that is one of the most powerful empires. The Persian Empire that succeeds the Babylonians is really, really a tremendous empire. And that's the empire that is the backdrop for the story of Esther and Mordecai. That's the Persian Empire, the Achaemenid dynasty that Alexander the Great eventually destroys when he goes to war against the Persians and helps liberate Europe from the Persians, because the Persians went all the way into Greece, all the way into, all the way across Asia Minor and into Greece, and controlled major parts of Greece. That's how far the Persian Empire went. So let's read a little bit more about what this means for the Babylonians. Back to them.
Do not be downhearted or afraid at the rumors heard in the land. A rumor will come one year, and another rumor the next year, of violence in the land and of ruler against ruler. Assuredly, days are coming when I will deal with Babylon's images. Her whole land shall be shamed, and all her slain shall fall in her midst. Heavens and earth and all that is in them shall shout over Babylon, for the ravagers shall come upon her from the north, declares God. Yes, Babylon is to fall for the slain of Israel, as the slain of all the earth have fallen through Babylon. You fugitives from the sword, go, don't delay. Remember God from afar and call Jerusalem to mind. We were shamed. We heard taunts. Humiliation covered our faces when aliens entered the sacred areas of God's house.
And it's not aliens from outer space.
No.
It's aliens who are Zarim. They are non-Israelites. Non-Israelites went into our temple. They went into the Holy of Holies. They went into the Beit HaMikdash. They went into the house of God, and they destroyed it. And we were humiliated. We were shamed. But don't be afraid, folks, because God is going to exact retribution on those people. And you could imagine, we said the same thing when the Romans did it later. This is, that's the promise of vengeance.
Assuredly, days are coming, declares God, when I will deal with her images, and throughout her land the dying shall groan. Though Babylon should climb to the skies, though she fortify her strongholds up to heaven, the ravagers would come against her from me, declares God. Hark, an outcry from Babylon, great destruction from the land of the Chaldeans. For God is ravaging Babylon. He will put an end to her great din, whose roar is like waves of mighty waters, whose tumultuous noise resounds. For a ravager is coming upon Babylon. Her warriors shall be captured, their bows shall be snapped, for the Eternal is a God of requital who deals retribution. I will make her officials and her sages drunk, her governors and prefects and warriors, and they shall sleep an endless sleep, never to awaken, declares the King, whose name is God of hosts. Thus said God of hosts, Babylon's broad wall shall be knocked down and her high gates set afire. Peoples shall labor for naught, and nations have wearied themselves for fire. The instructions that the prophet Jeremiah gave to Seraiah, son of Neriah, son of Maaseiah, when the latter went with King Zedekiah of Judah to Babylonia in the 4th year of Zedekiah's reign. Seraiah was quartermaster. Jeremiah wrote down in one scroll all the disaster that would come upon Babylon, all these things that are written concerning Babylon. And Jeremiah said to Seraiah, when you get to Babylon, see that you read out all these words and say, O Eternal One, you yourself have declared concerning this place that it shall be cut off without inhabitants, humans or animals, that it shall be a desolation for all time. And when you finish reading this scroll, tie a stone to it and hurl it into the Euphrates.
So it's a very, very interesting thing that just happened, which we very rarely see in the Bible. We saw it a little bit in Jeremiah already, which was a description of how these things were recorded. But here it says specifically in the text that Jeremiah tells the people when they are going into exile, and he gives it to the leaders of the exile, this last exile that goes in with Zedekiah, right? And he gives it to Seraiah, who's also part of that family, but it's Baruch's brother, Seraiah. He goes in with Zedekiah into Babylonia, okay? And he tells him to take this scroll, right? Take this scroll and tell the people in Babylonia, tell the Jews that are going with you what's going to happen. And this scroll is going to be thrown into the Euphrates, into their great river. Like the Nile, Babylonia has these great rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. Most of the emphasis in the Bible, by the way, is on the Euphrates, right? It's on that river. But, you know, the Tigris and Euphrates are the two rivers that run through that area, Mesopotamia. But but the references are always to the Euphrates. That's the river that runs by Babylon, and in Hebrew it's the Parat. The Babylonians and the Persians called it the Parat. The Greeks called it the Euparat, which means the good Parat. Right? EU before a word in Greek means good, like euthanasia, good death. Euparat is the good Parat, Euparat. But think about what Jeremiah just said. I'm not going with you. He's going the other direction. He's going to Egypt, which he didn't want to do, but he's not going with them. But he says, take my words with you, which is really powerful that he just says, take the words, and then do the symbolic act of throwing the words into their main river, the river that you're going to have to live next to by the waters of Babylon, which of course we read in Psalms, but what is the symbol of that, right? That's their life. That's the life-giving waters. All of Babylonia, all of Mesopotamia, which means between the rivers, between the Tigris and Euphrates River. That's what Mesopotamia means. It means between the rivers. Their whole life was based on the rivers, the canals, the channels that came off of those rivers, which fed their people. They now have a scroll in them. And what does the scroll say?
And say, thus shall Babylon sink and never rise again because of the disaster that I will bring upon it. And nations shall have wearied themselves for fire. Thus far, the words of Jeremiah.
And to some extent, that is really the last of Jeremiah. And the reason I say that is because chapter 52, which is the last chapter, is really, and by the way, what's the translation you have, Mary, at the end of the chapter 51? Verse 64 says in the King James,
"And thou shalt say, thus shall Babylon sing, and shall not rise from the evil that I will bring upon her, and they shall be weary. Thus far are the words."
yeah. So again, I don't love because of the disaster that I will bring upon it. There is a sense that this is Ra because of the evil, because of the things that they had done. And again, to some extent, this understanding that this is Jeremiah's pronouncement on Babylonia, which is quite scary for people that are going to live in that community, because they're going to have to live through that. They're going to have to live through that destruction. So they live through destruction of their own home in Jerusalem and Judah. And now they're going to go to Babylonia, and they're going to experience it again when the Persians run through and destroy it. So that's a very scary situation. Now, again, it doesn't happen the next day, but it's not a great situation to hear about, that you're going to be living through more destruction eventually in that country that you now live. So chapter 52 moves away from what we just read to some extent and is actually going back in time. So the words that we just heard come from Zedekiah, the time of Zedekiah, the last king of Judah, the one that gets taken into captivity, the one whose eyes are blinded out after he sees his sons murdered. His family is essentially, his legacy is wiped out. We read that his daughters survived, but his sons are wiped out. But he has a brother, Jeconiah, who was Coney, already taken away, already exiled by the Babylonians, already there, and he has not suffered the same fate as Zedekiah to some extent. Again, to remind you, that doesn't end the Jewish presence in Judah, right? Judah is still inhabited. We already read about it. And this is why we're going backwards in time. We read about what happened because we read about Gedaliah a few chapters ago, the Jewish governor who's appointed to be in charge of Judea for the Babylonians, a Jew who's murdered by the Jews who are still there, who don't want to have a Babylonian governor. They want their own governor, and they don't want the Babylonians even to have say over them through a governor. That also backfires. But we already read that. So now we're going back a little bit in time, and we're also focusing more on Babylonia in this last chapter, and you'll see why. So this is the last chapter of Jeremiah, and let's take a look and see how Jeremiah, at least in the text, ends, even though you'll see maybe why this was chosen as the end of it. No, but it is interesting that it doesn't end with the last things that Jeremiah says, because what the last thing that Jeremiah really said was just what we read, which was Babylonia is going to be destroyed. It's not even the last thing that happened to Jeremiah, because Jeremiah told us what happened during Gedaliah's time. So it's not even the last chronological parts of Jeremiah. But let's take a look at why this is the way it ends.
Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem for 11 years. His mother's name was Hamutal, daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah.
Different Jeremiah, right? It's not the same Jeremiah, but it shows you that Jeremiah was a name that other people had. He's not the only Jeremiah, okay?
He did what was displeasing to God, just as Jehoiakim had done. Indeed, Jerusalem and Judah were a cause of anger for God, so that they were cast out of the divine presence. Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon.
So all this stuff we've read about. This is all stuff that we've read about in Jeremiah. We read about it in Kings. There's nothing here that's new information. it's just reminding you that Zedekiah is the last king. He also didn't do well like his brothers had done. Remember, these are all sons of Josiah, except for one grandson, who also becomes king during this time, Jeremiah's nephew. But no new information here.
And in the 9th year of his reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, King Nebuchadnezzar moved against Jerusalem with his whole army. They besieged it and built towers against it all around. The city continued in a state of siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. By the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine had become acute in the city. There was no food left for the common people. Then the wall of the city was breached. All the soldiers fled. They left the city by night through the gate between the double walls, which is near the king's garden. The Chaldeans were all around the city, and they set out for the Arabah. But the Chaldean troops pursued the king, and they overtook Zedekiah in the steps of Jericho as his entire force left him and scattered.
Right. And so this is what we read about before, which is Zedekiah left. He fled the city as it was being under siege. We read what happened. I already told you what just happened.
The king of Babylon had Zedekiah's sons slaughtered before his eyes. He also had all the officials of Judah slaughtered at Riblah. Then the eyes of Zedekiah were put out, and he was chained in bronze fetters. The king of Babylon brought him to Babylon and put him in prison, where he remained to the day of his death.
Yep. Not a good end for Zedekiah. He's not killed, but to some extent, it's a fate worse than death. He watches his family executed, and he is in jail. He's in prison for the rest of his days.
They didn't reign very long.
These guys didn't. And again, the last few years, as we talked about, the last few years of the time of Judah, of the Davidic dynasty, was a disaster. And again, just to show you real quick, the map that the kingship times right here. This is Josiah, dies in 608. Jehoahaz becomes a king for literally like a minute. Then his other son, Jehoiakim, becomes king for about 10 years. Not a good guy. Then Jehoiachin, or Jeconiah, he becomes king for a brief moment. And then Zedekiah becomes king, as you can see, for about another 10 years. So the last, from the time that Josiah dies in 608 to 586, which, as you can see, is 20 years. During that 20-year time, we had 1, 2, 3, 4 kings. In 20 years, 3 brothers, Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, and Zedekiah, and then 1 grandson of Josiah, Jehoiachin. Now, that's not the end, though. Let's look at what happens. That's the end of Zedekiah.
Interesting how the father is good
Yes,
and all of his offspring.
we're not good. Yeah, yeah, it's a bad example. But remember, just to remind people, as we just look at that chart one more time, go back real quick. Josiah was very good. One of the undeniably, according to the Bible, really good kings. Well, he's really good to the priests. He was really good to the people who wrote the Bible. So he's considered a good guy. But look at his dad. His dad, Ammon, was not a good guy. His grandfather, Manasseh, wasn't good. Say he becomes good. I don't think he became that good, but he rules for a really long time now, 45 years. His father, Hezekiah, is the other good king. So Hezekiah and Josiah are good kings. They're good kings. But their fathers, their sons, not necessarily. So the Bible points out that just because your father was not a good guy doesn't mean you're not going to be a good guy. And just because your father was a good guy doesn't mean you're going to be a good guy. And so there's an interesting lesson there about what we call yichus in Hebrew or Yiddish. Yichus is your genealogy. You're very careful, because while it can help, it's not a guarantee. And the Bible will tell us that. Jewish history will tell us that. Examples abound about it. So if you ever get into a discussion with somebody and they say, oh, my grandfather was this great rabbi, and they'll go, okay. Some people will say, so what? Now, sometimes people get excited by it, but sometimes people don't. And it's very interesting, because they'll look at the Bible and they'll say, well, who cares? Josiah's father was not a good guy, and Josiah's son was not a good guy. So, don't tell me just because your father was a good guy that you're going to be a good guy. Sometimes it works out that way, but sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes the father who's not a good guy can have a really good son. So you never know. You have to be careful, and you don't assume that yichus means anything. Anyways, so that's the end of Zedekiah, but that's not the end of those guys, or let's say the whole history of the Jews, because let's read the way the chapter actually ends.
On the 10th day of the 5th month, that was the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, the chief of the guards, came to represent the king of Babylon in Jerusalem. He burned the house of God, the king's palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. He burned down the house of every notable person.
Yeah, and so it says here that Nebuchadnezzar actually did not do that. It says Nebuzaradan did it. That was the other official that he had, his chief of guards, his Rav Tavachim. That's this title that he has. He's like a general, right? He's a main general of his. He destroys the rest of Jerusalem, and especially, again, the temple, the Beit HaMikdash.
The entire Chaldean force that was with the chief of the guards tore down all the walls of Jerusalem on every side. The remnant of the people left in the city, the defectors who had gone over to the king of Babylon, and what remained of the artisans were taken into exile by Nebuzaradan, the chief of the guards. But some of the poorest elements of the population, some of the poorest in the land, were left by Nebuzaradan, the chief of the guards, to be vine dressers and field hands.
Is that the translation you have in your Bible for the poorest? Does it say the poorest of the land, Mary? Yeah. Yeah. So the Bible tells us that it was not completely depopulated, but the people who were left behind were not part of the higher classes of people. That's what it says. So the artisans, the skilled people, the leaders, the political leaders, the economic leaders, they're taken into exile. And the people that are left behind essentially are there to be caretakers for the Babylonians. They're there to, just monitor the situation and to send back product, but that's it. The leadership is all taken away. That's not true. It's not true, because we actually read that there were soldiers that were still left behind that were fighting. They're the people who end up killing Gedaliah. So it wasn't everybody, but for the most part, it was a tremendous destruction and a tremendous loss of life and a tremendous loss of infrastructure.
The Chaldeans broke up the bronze columns of the house of God, the stands, and the bronze tank that was in the house of God, and they carried all the bronze away to Babylon. They also took the pails, scrapers, snuffers, sprinkling bowls, ladles, and all the other bronze vessels used in the service. The chief of the guards took whatever was of gold and whatever was of silver, basins, fire pans, sprinkling bowls, pails, lampstands, ladles, and jars. The 2 columns, the 1 tank, and the 12 bronze oxen that supported it, and the stands, which King Solomon had provided for the house of God, all these objects contained bronze beyond weighing. As for the columns, each was 18 cubits high and 12 cubits in circumference. It was hollow, and the metal was 4 fingers thick.
So, these are, 30-foot high columns, 3 stories high. They're enormous, and they are taken away. They don't mention the ark. They don't mention the ark. Now, all this other stuff, which some of it, according to this, was from King Solomon's day, which would be 400 years old by that point. This is a tremendous amount of wealth that's taken away, which even in the ancient world or whatever would have been an enormous task. What was obviously different about the way we lived is that all of these things were for God. These were not for the kings. These were for God to have. So to some extent, the kings all knew that some of their greatest treasures were not theirs. They were part of the temple. You can imagine that sometimes they borrowed from the temple and they took stuff from the temple, but they knew that the real treasure was here in the temple.
It had a bronze capital above it. The height of each capital was 5 cubits, and there was a meshwork decorated with pomegranates about the capital, all made of bronze, and so for the second column, also with pomegranates. There were 96 pomegranates facing outward. All the pomegranates around the meshwork amounted to 100. The chief of the guards also took Sariah, the chief priest, and Zephaniah, the deputy priest, and the 3 guardians of the threshold. And from the city, he took a eunuch who was in command of the soldiers, 7 royal privy counselors who were present in the city, the scribe of the army commander who was in charge of mustering the people of the land, and 60 of the common people who were inside the city.
Yeah, that's an interesting description of, again, who were the people in charge. And it does use, again, the word saris. It uses the word eunuch for a description of the guy who was in command of the soldiers, which seems like an interesting responsibility for a man who was a eunuch, but it wasn't just the harem that these eunuchs were in charge of, at least in Israel. They were ones who were given military command in some cases. And we know that this was the case in other parts of the world. In the Middle East, also in China, we have descriptions from the same time of Chinese generals or Chinese leaders that were eunuchs as well. So it's not only they were put in charge of the harem because they couldn't do anything. These guys were also military, in some cases, generals. So, yeah, and it says that even some of the common people were taken. And what is the translation for that? That is Am Haaretz. Those are people of the land. That's the literal words in Hebrew, Am Haaretz, people of the land, the common people. I don't know, Mary, what does your translation have for common people? Yeah, that's the literal translation, people of the land. It definitely seems to imply that these are common people in the sense that these are not people who are from the caste or from a class that they're recognized as being priests or leaders or generals or officials. These are not. Later on, the word Am Haaretz in Hebrew and in the rabbinic period after the exile, the word Am Haaretz literally implies somebody who is a common person, a tradesperson, a trader, a farmer, somebody who's engaged in normal, everyday types of work. The rabbis start to differentiate an Am Haaretz not as a common person, but somebody who isn't one of them. And so the Bible talks about them I would say in a fairly derogatory way by saying that they're common people, but not that they're essentially, as the rabbis will later on say, people who just don't understand the law and are kind of unskilled or illiterate or, again, not people that you want to put in charge of religious responsibilities. So by the rabbinic period, the term Am Haaretz becomes more inclusive, not necessarily for people who aren't in the military or in the official classes, but literally people who are not part of the rabbinic community. What does that mean? That there were probably a lot of people by the rabbinic period, by the time the Jews returned, the differentiation wasn't whether you were part of the royal family or part of the officials, because they were not in charge of their country anymore. There was no Jewish king during that time until the Maccabees. There is no royal family. So there was no way to be part of that. And so by the rabbinic period, the term really is someone who isn't a follower of rabbinic tradition, somebody who really can't count on to know what they're supposed to do or not. And the way the Talmud describes this, it's a lot of people are Am Haaretz. A lot of people are people of the land who aren't necessarily following the law or aren't knowledgeable about Jewish law. So the term ends up meaning something a little different than it does here. But, I guess from the standpoint of whoever's in charge, to call someone an Am Haaretz means, again, somebody who is a peasant, if you will. But again, not that they're bad, necessarily bad because they're born that way, but because they just don't know. We'll talk about that. We talk about it in the Talmud. But anyways, here's what happens with the exiles.
Nebuzaradan, the chief of the guards, took them and brought them to the king of Babylon at Rivlah. The king of Babylon had them struck down and put to death at Rivlah in the region of Hamath. Thus Judah was exiled from its land.
Yeah, so at least these people were killed. It says they were killed at Riblah as punishment, in addition with Zedekiah's family. It says that. But now we're actually going to get numbers.
This is the number of those whom Nebuchadnezzar exiled in the 7th year, 3,023 Judeans. In the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar, 832 persons were exiled from Jerusalem. And in the 23rd year of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuzaradan, the chief of the guards, exiled 745 Judeans. The total amounted to 4,600 persons.
Now, there's really no reason to discount this number. This is not a crazy number. It's also very specific. It doesn't say 3,000. It says 3,023. It doesn't say 800. It says 832. I mean, these are numbers that are not even rounded numbers. Yes.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
When Nebuchadnezzar killed the people.
Yes.
And you said something, or he said something about that they deserve, this is what they deserve according to Nebuchadnezzar, but they didn't do anything except be Jewish.
Well, they had rebelled, right? Nebuchadnezzar had told them, Jeremiah had told them, don't rebel, don't fight back against me. They did, and they didn't stop after this. That's the crazy thing. So they take these Jews out to Riblah, they kill them. The people back in Judea don't say, oh, we better not rebel against Nebuchadnezzar. They continue to rebel against Nebuchadnezzar because they killed Gedaliah. They killed a Jew who was working for the Babylonians. And the Babylonians put another king on the throne, right? So they had King Jehoahaz, they got rid of him. They put on Jehoiakim. They got rid of him. They put Jehoiachin in, got rid of him. They put Zedekiah. Every time they changed the king, they were hoping that the king would behave. He didn't behave. Now, Zedekiah, we read this. Zedekiah calls Jeremiah into his courtyard, says to him, I can't control the people. I can't stop them from rebelling. I don't want to necessarily go along with this, but I have no choice. Because, Zedekiah is saying, if I don't go along with the people, they're going to kill me. If I go over to the Babylonians, they're going to kill me. What is he going to do? So he's in a real bad situation. I mean, I'm not making excuses. I don't know if Zedekiah was a good guy or not. He seems to me a pretty weak leader, but what's he going to do? what's the guy going to do? And he seems, at least with Jeremiah, to know he's not doing the right thing, but he really doesn't know what to do. He can't really figure it out and out. And guess what? Jeremiah couldn't either, because Jeremiah didn't even get to control his destiny. Jeremiah gets taken in essentially as hostage by the people and brought down to Egypt. He didn't have a choice. So it's not a good situation for anybody. And it's definitely not a good situation for the kings. It was not, at least during this time, good to be the king. As Mel Brooks said, it's not good to be the king if you're one of these guys. This is a horrible situation to be. And Zedekiah runs away. Zedekiah tries to flee. He tried to just save his life. That didn't work. I mean, it worked. He didn't die, but I don't know that he wanted to live after having his kids murdered in front of him and then being blinded, having his eyes taken out. So these guys that get taken into exile, these are the leaders of Judea. It doesn't stop. So as I said, they put 4 different kings in charge. They couldn't stop it. They get rid of the kings. They put a governor in charge. That doesn't stop. We didn't stop fighting. So I don't know what to tell you other than I don't know what the answer is. We have Jeremiah's side of it, which is that the people should have just submitted to Nebuchadnezzar and survived. That's what his standpoint was.
The only ones who survived were the uneducated who got out of the land.
Yeah.
The law.
So that was the irony. That's what Jeremiah is pointing out. And the people who are part of Jeremiah's circle, somebody just told us the only people that were left were the poor, and they had really no idea what to do. So 4,600 people are taken into exile with this group. Now, again, this is not every Jew that got taken into exile. It's not every Jew who survived. Clearly, there are other Jews who survived. We don't know how many Am Haaretz there are. We don't know how many people were left behind, really. We really don't. Here's what it says.
In the 37th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin of Judah, on the 25th day of the 12th month, King Evil-Merodach of Babylon, in the year he became king, took note of King Jehoiachin of Judah and released him from prison.
Now, what's so interesting about that phrase is that there is still a Jewish king in Babylonia whose eyes haven't been put out, whose kids haven't been killed. He's been sitting in exile in Babylonia for a long time. And this is King Jehoiachin. This is the son of Jehoiachin. This is Zedekiah's nephew, who has still been in exile. Now, again, he's a survivor. He's an interesting dude because he's a survivor. Yeah. No, grandson of Josiah. So again, here it is, just so you don't, real clear. Here is Jehoiakim, and here's Jehoiachin. This is his son, right? So he got taken away, and so Zedekiah, his uncle, these sons of Josiah, Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, Zedekiah are all kings. So it's a little confusing because his name is so similar to his dad's. But he is there. He's also known as Jeconiah. He's also called Jeconiah. He is there in the capital. He's in Babylon. And what's interesting about this is, and of course, as as Rosemary just read very correctly, his king Evel-Merodach is not evil Merodach. His name is not evil. He's not evil. It's Avel or Amel in Babylonian, and it literally means a man of Marduk. Their god, Marduk, which we also said is Mordechai. That is their god. So Marduk is a guy who comes from, is one of Marduk's people, one of Marduk's men, which is, he's God's man. And you can see he is the successor to Nebuchadnezzar. So why? why. It is not clear why he is made the successor, because it seems that he did, number one, did not get along with his father, and he was not the oldest son, but he is the one who takes over. Now, we don't really know, but as we're about to read right now, he is known for releasing Jeconiah. Now, I will tell you, because the Bible doesn't tell us this, or actually, wait a second, not sure, but he was overthrown and murdered by his brother-in-law, who took over as king. So that'll happen in his life as part of Evel Marduk's life. But look what he did. He took note of King Jehoiakim and he released him from prison. And here's what he did.
He spoke kindly to him and gave him a throne above those of other kings who were with him in Babylon. He removed his prison garments, and Jehoiakim ate regularly in his presence the rest of his life. A regular allotment of food was given him by order of the king of Babylon, an allotment for each day to the day of his death, all the days of his life.
Yeah. And that is the last words of Jeremiah. Now, I'm only telling you that this is a weird way to end because this doesn't say anything about what Jeremiah had to say about it. Jeremiah is a prophet. The story ends with the life of Jeconiah. Now, well, you could probably guess why it ends this way, right? It kind of ends on a happy note, or a happier note, that this Jewish king is treated well by his Babylonian counterpart. We don't really know why, again, speculation that they were maybe imprisoned by Nebuchadnezzar together and they developed some kind of friendship. We don't know. It says that he does have a better treatment than the other kings who were held captive in Babylon, right? There are other kings who are there too. He's one of the kings that's treated well as a captive king. And he takes care of them. It's a very weird story to end with, but this is the way the book of Jeremiah ends. So it doesn't end with what happens to Jeremiah. It doesn't end with what happens to the people in Judea and Judah. It doesn't really end with that. I mean, we read about it. We read about the fact that there are poor people left, but that's not the last words of it. The last words are about this one guy in particular. It's a very weird way to end. But in a way, if you think about it, it's a really powerful way to end the book, because what it also does is it ends with this sense of there's a big sweeping thing that happens, which is the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the kingdom of Judah, the end to this reign of the Davidic line. It's a huge chapter of Jewish history that comes to an end here. And here, what we're left with is, what does it mean to one guy? What does it mean to Jeconiah, to Jehoiakim? What does it mean to this guy? What does it mean to one of David's descendants who lives out the rest of his life as a captive king in the land of Babylonia? It's where he'll die. Doesn't say anything about his family. There are legends about his family. I'll show you right now. He ate well. He's taken care of. But what kind of life was that? What kind of life was it like for this guy? What's interesting again is that the Bible, to me, this is a perfect example of how the Bible deals with life, which is this a happily ever after story? Not really. I mean, no one would say, hey, that's a great way for a person to live his life. But it's life. And sometimes the best we can do is make the best out of a really bad situation. And it's not a happily ever after. The Bible doesn't end like a fairy tale, and definitely not like a Disney fairy tale. These are not stories where you're like, that's a great way to end. But these are stories of life. And, it's this weird kind of like, what are you supposed to say? What is the answer when you survive. And unfortunately, that's life. You know, you think about it, and I think about it a lot because unfortunately, there's very few of these people who are still alive. I mean, what do you say to a person who's a survivor, right? Who's lost all their family, right? Everyone was murdered. They're the only person, Eddie Hirsch's mom, who just died last year. I mean, so many people that I know and I hear about and I've done funerals for. And you're like, well, they lived the rest of their life and they got to see their grandkids or even, God willing, great grandkids. But how do you ever tell somebody that's a happily ever after story? It's not. There's no good end to that story where you go, oh, well, they got all these wonderful blessings because they had to live with this guilt and this knowledge that, like, why me? Why did I live? You know, all those feelings of sadness and just questions of how is that a happy ending? It's not. You're like, well, they lived. Yeah, they did. But what do they always have to carry with them? So there's no happily ever after story there. I hate to tell you, but it's not. There's good ends and there's people who had good things that happen in their lives, but you never forget that. You can't. And so the Bible doesn't paint a picture like that, you know, that's not life. So it's not easy. It's not like it's not there's no way to say, well, yeah, we can all take comfort in this now. No, we actually have to deal with yeah, we got a problem.
Here's estimated from time that table of nations, right, from the time of Ham, Cush.
Yeah, to this.
How many years? It took a long
Well, that's
time
the
for
interesting.
because if Babylon was a thorn in God's side, it
Yeah.
sure took a long time to dispose of it.
Well, remember, Babylonia is essentially used as a punisher in the Bible. That's the other weird thing about it, which is Nebuchadnezzar has a weird role in the Bible. I just want to point out here, Jehoiakim, somebody said, well, what else? According to the Midrash, it says in rabbinical literature, he was made king of his father by Nebuchadnezzar. Well, we know that. So let's just talk about what it says. What the rabbis say about him. Here's what it says. Jehoiakim's sad experiences changed his nature entirely. As he repented of the sins which he'd committed as king, he was pardoned by God, who revoked the decree to the effect that none of his descendants should ever become king. He even became the ancestor of the Messiah. It was especially his firmness in fulfilling the law that restored him to God's favor. He was kept by Nebuchadnezzar in solitary confinement, as he was therefore separated from his wife. The Sanhedrin, which had been expelled with him to Babylon, feared that at his death, the death of his queen, the house of David would become extinct. So this becomes an interesting issue, which is the Davidic dynasty continuing through Jehoiakim? This is what the rabbis were concerned with. They managed to gain favor of Queen, and again, this is not don't have a version of this in the Bible. We don't have a version of this in Babylonian texts, but this is the Midrash. They managed to gain favor of Queen Semiramis, who induced Nebuchadnezzar to ameliorate the lot of the captive king by permitting his wife to share his prison. As he then manifested great self-control and obedience to the law, God forgave him his sins. Jehoiakim lived to see the death of his conqueror Nebuchadnezzar, which brought him liberty. For within 2 days of his father's death, Avel Moradoch opened the prison in which Jehoiakim had languished for so many years. Jehoiakim's life is best illustration of the maxim: during prosperity, a man must never forget the possibility of misfortune, and adversity must not despair of prosperity's return. That's the Midrash. So don't ever think that you could lose everything. And when you lose everything, don't ever think that you couldn't get it back. On the advice of Jehoiakim, Nebuchadnezzar's son cut his father's body into 300 pieces, which he gave to 300 vultures, so they could be sure that Nebuchadnezzar would never return to worry him. That's an interesting midrash. They cut him up, and that Merodach, Evel Merodach agreed with that, right?
Messiah that what they were worried about?
Yeah, well, they were worried about what Nebuchadnezzar could continue to do if he was resurrected. It was Jehoiakim who also erected the magnificent mausoleum at the grave of prophet Ezekiel's grave. We're about to read Ezekiel. In the Second Temple period, there was a gate called Jeconiah's Gate, because according to tradition, Jeconiah left the temple through that gate and we went into exile. So this talks about his genealogy, and here's what it says. In the listing of genealogy in the book of Matthew, in the Christian Bible, Jeconiah is an ancestor of Joseph, the husband of Mary. And I actually shared that with you a few weeks ago. I don't know if you remember. But interestingly, the Christians believe that Jesus was somehow descendant from Jeconiah. Why? Because that makes him a descendant of David, which of course begs the question, if you're a descendant from God, what difference does it make whether you're a descendant of David or not? But the Christian Bible has it both ways, which is, well, it definitely makes him Jewish because he had to be the Messiah as a descendant of right. And so here, right, says there, lists the lineage of Jesus through Jeconiah. Why? As Doreen just said, if you make him the Messiah through David, then he is definitely the Messiah. And the rabbis were also concerned for the same reason. I just showed it to you. It says that he was able to have kids. It says in the Midrash right here, he was even became the ancestor of the Messiah. That's from the Tanhuma. That's from the Midrash translated or put together by Martin Buber. It shows that the Jewish traditions of Jeconiah being the ancestor of the Messiah existed as well. So it was very important for us to
They had to establish lineage.
yes, and they had to, and the only person that could really come through was this guy Jeconiah. So this, by the way, is a very interesting thing that we have, which is a clay tablet, right? Which lists the rations that were given to the kings. And right here, and this again is in the, it was found in Babylon, but it is in the museum in Berlin. The Vorder Asiatisches. It's Akkadian. So it's in Germany. You can see it. They excavated it. That's how they wound up with these treasures. Yeah, you can see this thing. So there actually is proof. Well, we shouldn't really be surprised, but we have proof not only that he was in Babylonia. The Bible says in Jeremiah that he's taken care of by the king. And we actually found the Akkadian version of this. So this is one of those things that's corroborated by the Bible. No, nobody's going to go, oh, wow, it says it in the Bible. And so the weird thing, of course, is that people who say that the stuff in the Bible didn't happen. But we have proof that some of the stuff happened. Doesn't mean everything in the Bible happened. I'm not saying that. But you can't say that there aren't things that have been corroborated from the Bible. If we find it in an extra biblical source, we didn't preserve this, we uncovered it. Nobody said we've got to keep this. Somebody dug it up, dusted it off, translated it from Akkadian. The people there didn't read it. They didn't know Akkadian. They speak Arabic. They don't read this language. Some guy translated this and told them what? Yeah, it's similar to Semitic language. There, you can see the words and you can figure them out. It's not written it's a syllabic alphabet, so it's written with they're not letters, they're syllables, and so the words are constructed differently, but you can understand them. I mean, if somebody writes out something in Akkadian, not me, I didn't take Akkadian, but I think I was supposed to. I think I actually might have taken a couple of classes of Akkadian, and then I said, this is, I actually took it at Oxford, and I was like, I am not going to, this is not going to help me that much. but I mean, look, I mean, it would be great to look at that and be able to read it. But first of all, you need a magnifying glass to read that anyways, but it's unbelievable when you actually see something that is exactly what the Bible says happened. And this happens to be one of those texts. So Jeconia is referred. No, but most of that is not historical text, right? Most of it isn't telling us what happened. And this, again, this is not like nobody thought that this was important. The guy who wrote this for the Akkadian in Akkadian in the first place, the guy in the Babylonian court who wrote this, didn't think that thousands of years later someone would put it in a museum because they wrote about this dude that they had in prison. That's the reality. Some dudes in prison in our country are in captivity, and we wrote about him because we wrote about a bunch of kings that we had in captivity. And here it happens to be this guy. But we put it in a museum in Germany because it means something to us.
That's what he was eating.
Yes.
What's
This
it,
is the
what's it,
last line of Jeremiah.
what's it from?
What? It's
Like the daily newspaper?
no, it was from this list of
Oh, I understand.
it was a royal document. It was a royal document that people kept because the king told them for it to be kept.
So even at that time, there is clear evidence of historical record requirements.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I mean, this happens to be it.
How many times do we read the Bible and says it refers to this book or that book that we don't have anymore?
Yeah, we have a lot of that, right? So we have historical books that the Bible refers to as historical books that we don't have because the Bible isn't a history. I mean, that's one of the great things about it is that we actually are synthesizing history. Yeah, and this weird thing that the Bible itself says, this isn't a history book. But again, some of it has been verified by history. Now, again, Jeconia is an interesting dude because, as it says in Jeremiah, record this man as if childless. A man will not prosper in his lifetime, for none of his offspring will prosper. None will sit on the throne of David or rule anymore in Judah. Now, that's what Jeremiah himself said about Jeconia because he didn't like him. The Bible tells us that fact. But yet, in the Midrash, he takes on a really interesting role. And even if you want to say in Christianity, takes on a very interesting role because he's got to be the ancestor of the Messiah. If you read the book of Jeremiah, Jeremiah seems to be cursing him and saying he's never going to have any descendants and none of them are going to sit on the throne of David anymore. Now, what's interesting is they're both true because while you have these ancestry, this tradition of this, the reality is that he becomes to some extent the connector between exile and the kingdom of David. Now, I will tell you too, and it says right here, in addition, that his descendants, according to tradition, become exilarchs. Let me show you. So here's the translation, by the way. Tablets were translated in 1930 by German Assyriologist Ernst Feiner. And here's what it says. It was part of, again, the Royal Archive from the Ishtar Gate, which I told you, if you want to go to Berlin, you can see it. I've taken people to see it because I think I took you to see it. The Ishtar Gates are at the Berlin at the on the island, on the museum island, and they're beautiful blue gates. You've seen them. You just don't remember. But here's one of the tablets. It says the king of Judah gets this amount, and here it says later on 1.5 silla of oil for these people, 3.5 for Greek craftsmen. By the way, it shows you they had Greeks there too, and it says to Yaku Akunu, which is the son of Judah's king. Interestingly, it doesn't say. Yeah. And that's how much he gets, which is a lot. I mean, 10 silla is more than most of these other people get. I mean, this is 11.5 silla for 8 woodworkers, 8 people getting this. So he's getting as much as, 5 or 6 people. So he's getting quite a lot. This is oil. This is his oil allotment. And again, this is in the Pergamum Museum in Berlin on the Museum Island.
Digs are still happening, correct?
They are. they're not happening at the rate that they should because people are still unsure of the political situation. A lot of universities don't want to invest long-term in putting up I think it's going to take another 10, 15 years before people have any feeling that investing money in a dig in a country that is unstable, but
Or could it be that they're not getting the answers they want to see?
yeah, and I would say that there's a feeling that a lot of the really good stuff has already been found, but we don't know that. I mean, the point is that they're not going to put a lot of money into digs in Iran and Iraq until those situations get sorted out. Look, I'm not going to tell you anything you don't already know. We're not really concerned with digging up archaeological evidence from these countries. We want oil from these countries. We don't really care about anything other than whether we can dig oil out of those countries. The archaeological evidence and the history, very, very down the list of things that we care about in those countries. I don't know if anyone would care about anything in those countries other than archaeological evidence if it wasn't for our reliance on oil. If it hadn't been for oil, who knows? Who knows what would have happened in the Middle East, folks? We'll never know. But our reliance on their oil created a very interesting situation. We will next week read Ezekiel, and we'll be getting into Ezekiel. And he is mentioned, Jeconiah is mentioned in the book of Ezekiel, and he's an important guy in that book as well. Or at least for Ezekiel, who is taken into captive. So Jeconiah is one of those guys that we don't know a lot about. We really don't know that much about him. The Bible doesn't tell us that much about him, but he's arguably, again, one of the more important people in the Bible. And the fact that Jeremiah ends with him is probably because he was that link between the old world and the new world, the world of David with the world of the exile. And he's part of our imagination to some extent as one of those ultimate survivors. It's just one of those stories that you're like, how does this happen? And what's interesting, of course, is that we have historical evidence that it happened. That's the really kind of crazy thing, is that in 1930, we translated this document and said, oh, this actually really did happen exactly the way Jeremiah counted it. So it is kind of amazing that ended up happening, which we probably never could have imagined. At least not the rabbis who wrote about Jeconiah as well. So we'll read more about him. And again, as we've come to the end of Jeremiah, by the way, Jeconiah, to some extent, one of my favorite movies, actually just one of my favorite movies, period. But one of the movies that touches on this issue of the ultimate survivor is The Last Emperor by Bertolucci. It was about Henry Puyi, the last emperor of China, who ends up surviving and ends up living out the rest of his days in communist China as a complete unknown. Somebody who nobody paid attention to, but yet was a guy who bridged the old world and the new world, and just somehow survived. So it's an interesting movie, and it's a beautiful movie, but it's one of those movies that's true. It's a true story of how sometimes people have these weird lives that touch different worlds, and they kind of, they survive somehow. So
No class for that,
yes, thank you for because it's my anniversary. It's my 30th anniversary. And 30th anniversary. So I forgot to mention that. I put it in the newsletter. She wants to celebrate, John. Thanks, John. She wants to celebrate. She wants to be recognized. She should. So yes, it is. Sometimes it happens during the high holidays, which also happens. But yeah, this time it's not. It's a little bit before. But what's weird is I actually have to do a wedding tomorrow which was really weird. I was asked by one of my former students to do a wedding. So we're actually doing the wedding, and we're staying overnight in Santa Barbara tomorrow night. So yes, I do get to celebrate my anniversary a little bit, but I did not mention it last Wednesday, and I'll send out an email to all of our Wednesday participants, but thanks for reminding me that we're off that Wednesday. We're really not off during the holidays, by the way, because the holidays are on the weekend. So we're not going to be missing any time for the holidays, but that's just a weird schedule. So again, thanks everybody for studying Jeremiah with us over these last couple of months. Tom v'nishalem tehillah el borei olam, who give praise to God, the creator of everything, as we come to the end. And it's a good time to start getting into the next book, Ezekiel, which is it's not like any other, it's like no other book of the Bible. It's definitely like no other prophetic book in the level of what we're about to embark on. So next week, when we start Ezekiel, I will warn you that people have been cautioned, they've been warned that when they study the book of Ezekiel, especially the first chapter that we're about to read next week, that you have to prepare yourself, because it can throw people into difficulty of, it's not for children, even though it's not violent, it's not scary. Well, I don't know, maybe it's scary, but it is mystical, and it was seen as something that people who were too young should not study. People should not study it by themselves. People should just say immature. I said young. Thank you, Mike. So I said that we, so be prepared next week. And also, again, if you want to read about Ezekiel at a time, we'll talk about it next week. But if you want to read about Ezekiel, I can only tell you there's so much about that first chapter that we can study the first chapter. There's some people do study the first chapter for years. I don't mean a week. I don't mean a month. They study the first chapter of Ezekiel for years, and they get drawn into it, and they sink their whole lives into trying to understand that. I don't know what to tell you other than we're not going to study it for years, but we will study from it what we can.
Ezekiel comes, I mean, it's chronologically after Jeremiah.
It overlaps. He overlaps with him because we're going to read about Jeconiah. So he overlaps with him, and he is writing at the same time as Jeremiah. So again, thank you, Rosemary, for
Thank you.
taking us through. And we will see everybody in the coming days. Shana Tova, everyone. Happy New Year. Happy New Year. Take care.
Happy New Year.
Thanks.
Take care. Thank you.
Bye. Yeah. Bye.
Goodbye.
I watched those shows.